This has always blown my mind. 93% of people that listen to this show have not subscribed yet. So, could I ask you for a small favor? If you like what we're doing here, and you like the show, and you like the conversations I'm having, the simplest, freest way to help and support this is just subscribe. Subscribe on YouTube or follow on Spotify. This will help us bring better guests like the one today and more every single episode. Today's episode is with the former editor of Financial Times, Lionel Barber, talking about his latest biography, the first Western biography written on a global business tycoon, Masayoshi Son, or Masa. And let's dive right in. There's a lot to talk to you about. One, of course, we will talk about this book right here. But I wanted to start off with a little bit more about your backstory. So, in an interview before, you have talked about your father and how he was a journalist himself, and you've also said this that you wondered when you were getting into journalism if you could ever be as good as your father in journalism. How do you think your father would see you now after this insane journey you've had?
Well, I think he would be very proud in one sense because he didn't have the same opportunities that I had growing up because he left school. He was barely 15. He was probably just 14, 15. He didn't go to college. He was totally self-educated. He grew up in the north of England. He came from a somewhat broken home and he made everything. He was self-taught. So the fact that one of his three sons, we've all done quite well, motivated partly by him. I think the fact that I got to the top of my profession as a journalist, he would be very proud of that. And then he'd probably be saying, but why did you do this? Or what about the problem there? I mean, he was a tough taskmaster.
When you look back at your own journey through FT and before, is there a particularly compelling story that you never ran and you really wanted to explore more?
Well, we did spend 2 to 3 years trying to investigate the sources and size of Vladimir Putin's wealth. And I'd love to have published the story, but it wasn't there. We just didn't have enough reliable information. It was a very difficult story. So, in that sense, I regret we weren't able to publish something at length. We did publish other stories, individual stories about his business links, his business partners, but we never really got underneath it. And that would have been something that I would have liked to have done. But there are two things. First is, I don't ever look back. I make decisions. They were the ones that I think were right at the time. I consulted people in many instances. So there's no point in looking back. And second, I never sat on a story that I really felt could or should have appeared, but I was being put under pressure because I didn't respond to that kind of pressure or anybody. I was an independent editor.
So, talking about this side, you kind of went with the flow, what you felt right in the stories you want to tell. You've obviously been around a lot of powerful people, lot of world leaders, friends with some of them, but as you say, like you don't really draw that friendship too close. So, when you look back at this fine balance between being an outsider but also being an insider with access, how do you sort of keep that attachment and report objectively? What is something you tell someone that's getting into journalism?
Access is double-edged. You obviously can get close to people and see them up close, but you can't become friends. So I would slightly balk at your characterization of my relationships with people. I think there are maybe two public servants who I was friendly with, but in both instances, I definitely published stories that they were not happy about. Because in the end, if you're going to be a serious, strong, independent editor, you can't afford to have friends. And by the way, you can't really afford to have friends in the newspaper because you have to be detached. So my advice in terms of access is every once in a while, kick the source.
So, I have two more questions on this topic because I find it to be very interesting. How did you learn this lesson, for example?
About detachment from sources. Oh, I think I can remember one instance where I told a source that we were going to publish a story. And this was in 1986 after I joined the FT. And in the end, we didn't publish the story. So the source, who was a very senior person, spoke to me and said, well, what's going on? I should never have shared that information. You should never promise people that things are going to be published, especially if you're a reporter and they're beyond your control. And then you shouldn't be in the position of telling people, sharing that kind of confidential information, because it's not appropriate. So when I raised this with a more experienced colleague who was a ferocious woman who was defense editor at the time, I got a right bollocking, and I didn't forget that for a long time.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I want to dive into Masa's story and your book and questions around that. When you were thinking about who to write a biography on, was there anyone else on the table that you were really thinking about?
Well, I thought about writing a book about a scandal in the city of London in the mid 80s, which I was involved in, involving the Guinness Company, drinks company. And there were several people who were members of the establishment who did not go to prison, but who were probably as guilty as some of the people who did go to prison. So I was quite interested in reviving that story and talking about privilege. So it wasn't a biography as such, but it was a story. And then I did toy with a biography of Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor, because that's Germany, which I'm very interested in as a country. I'm a German speaker, studied it at Oxford at university. But then I realized that I wanted to do a book which was more about, a bit more current, and also which combined technology, politics, and finance. And so I had to find a person who kind of epitomized that, and then where I could do something which hadn't been done before. And so I thought about this man, Masayoshi Son, the founder of Softbank, who I had met, but only briefly. And he'd always been this slightly mysterious figure. And I thought there's no Western biography, so I should do him. I did suggest it to a couple of publishers or agents, and then they encouraged me.
What were some assumptions you had about Masa before and then post writing the book? What has changed in your mind?
I definitely thought of him as a great salesman, possibly somebody who took undue risk and was a bit of a fly-by-night, as we say in England. Somebody who, maybe it was a lot of black boxes, that SoftBank was a house of cards. But above all, it was just, he's a bit weird. And he describes himself as in very strange terms, almost like, he uses this Star Wars vocabulary. I mean, all of this was, so what is the story behind the story? And I think after spending more than 3 years writing and researching this book, I came to a much more nuanced view of him as a rather serious businessman, not just a kind of joker figure, and somebody who was really quite a consequential investor in our times, but with a massive risk appetite, with probably elements of recklessness and hubris. But overall, an absolutely fascinating character, and it's certainly a lot more nuanced. And I'd say one other thing, that I kind of had a much better appreciation of his background in Japan as a Korean Japanese, as a oppressed minority, ethnic minority. I just didn't really appreciate that side at all.
What has led to his, I guess, reckless behavior? What do you see as the patterns from childhood or somewhere that have led him to be such a high risk taker?
I think he's desperate to prove himself in the eyes of his father, in the eyes of who, by the way, was in pachinko gambling, so he had a pretty high risk appetite as well. In fact, told me this story about when he bought a pachinko parlor in order to bring in the people, the customers. He actually fixed the pins so everybody would win for a couple of weeks, which of course led to massive losses. But then he got the volume of customers through, and they all thought that this was the best place in town. So it's that kind of seat of your pants risk that I think he inherited from his father, the hustler. But then also somebody said, to understand Masa, you have to understand he's got a massive chip on his shoulder because he's an outsider and he's not accepted by the Japanese establishment. So that's a big motivating force for Masa. And I think that explains a lot. It's not quite true to say that his motivation comes from the fact that he came from nothing. And then once he made his fortune, he wanted to make bigger fortune. Actually, he did come from nothing for the first sort of 4 or 5 years. But after that, his father was doing quite well as first of all, loan shark, pig breeder, and then pachinko.
And a bootlegger as well, huh?
A bootlegger at about 13 years old in the shanty town where they grew up.
But at the same time, Masa did not want to be like his father.
That's an important insight, that he could have followed his father into pachinko, but that would have meant being undercover, retaining his Japanese alias, because that's what a lot of the Koreans do if they don't naturalize. They're literally living two characters, two personalities. One's the Japanese, the alias, and then they're Korean. And he said, I want to be Korean. I don't want to be living a false life. So he did, and it's an important episode in his life. He left as a teenager, age 15, to be educated in the States. He was at high school in the States and then at Holy Names College and then Berkeley. So spent about 6 years, this is in the late 70s, and then came back to Japan to make it. But when he came back, he pretty well said, no, I'm going to be Korean. I'm going by my name, Son, not the Japanese alias, Yasumoto. And that's a big break because all his Korean relatives said, you're crazy. You'll never be able to get a bank loan. You won't be able to get employees. This is the most ridiculous thing. And he just said, no, I'm going to do it on my own. And I'm going to have a business, my own company. And then he spent a few months kind of not working out what to do. And then he decided to go into software distribution. 1981.
Right. So how does he view Japan? And how does Japan view him as of now?
Well, the establishment in Japan remains rather suspicious of Masa because he doesn't make anything. He's not building ships or manufacturing steel or making cars. He's into investing. He's into technology, global investing, and he's a very disruptive force. So he created a broadband and mobile phone business out of nothing and took on the corporate establishment. So they are very wary, maybe a little bit jealous, definitely prejudiced. There are some Japanese who kind of have a grudging admiration for him and also see him as a necessary tonic to the innate risk-averse Japanese corporate mentality. How he views Japan, I don't believe, as some people suggest, that he's anti-Japanese, that he really doesn't like. I think he wants to be Korean Japanese in Japan. He definitely wants to provoke Japan into change and to be an evangelist for technological change and kind of make Japan great again. Now, sometimes I wonder whether because he picks up Japanese historical figures, episodes in history, and he makes a big thing about modeling himself on this great samurai reformer, Sakamoto Ryomo, from the mid-19th century. I sometimes think he's more Japanese than the Japanese. So that makes me a little bit suspicious. It's too much. But he's Japanese. Yes, and I think he sees, he doesn't want Japan just to go into a sort of demographic decline spiral. He wants when he started his business in 1981, many people, including many people in America, thought that Japan was going to be the number one economic power. It didn't work out like that.
Can you talk a little bit more about what do you see is his strategy for investments? Like, have you seen a strategy in the plays that he does?
He definitely wants to pick businesses that he thinks can really be big. He's not interested in anything which is incremental or marginal. I mean, he wants he wants $1 trillion company. I mean, he always uses ridiculous figures. Except some people thought he was being ridiculous when he talked about $100 billion investment fund. And he did actually create that in 2016 in the Softbank Vision Fund. But he's looking at companies that have capacity for great growth, where they can be disruptors against incumbents, and also where there's charismatic founders. Some would say a sucker, some would say this is like him. So he definitely likes that. You won't go anywhere if you're a shrinking violet trying to get Masa to invest. And I think he looks for bottlenecks in the economy. So he's always talking a lot about infrastructure. So with the internet, he's essentially supplying broadband. He's looking at applications of technology. That's where his main focus is.
Yeah, and that's kind of showed out in Yahoo in the
Yeah.
beginning when he started off with that, and then Alibaba as well. In the book, you said he was the only guy in the room that actually invested in Alibaba at the time when Jack Ma was actually pitching this idea.
Yeah, he went on a speed dating session, as they call it, with his fellow investors in Beijing in 1999, at the end of the year. And we were coming up to the peak of the bubble. Alibaba was only, a few months old. Goldman Sachs had invested in them. And he was the only person in the group of people with him who thought that Jack Ma was the real deal. And he insisted on investing in Alibaba. And crucially, stayed with Alibaba. So he was not an early seller. He didn't trade out like Goldman Sachs. And I think from what people have told me, including Joe Tsai, who was the co-founder with Jack Ma of Alibaba, he said that, Masa played a very important role in developing the business model, particularly the B2B, crucial B2B model.
In the sense of, you just said that he was looking kind of for basically himself and others, this like delusional almost sense of reality where like it has to be this big thing that someone is trying. You interviewed him a few times, and the people that were involved. Like, could you share any example of incidents where you saw a dissonance in what Masa was saying and what another person in the same story was saying?
I interviewed him 4 times. On ARM, which is the advanced semiconductor designer, British-based, he was talking at the time of acquisition, which was 2015, 16, summer of 2016. He was talking about the Internet of Things, where billions of devices were to be connected to each other all around the world. It would be amazing. And Hermann Hauser, the famed founder, just thought he was talking nonsense. I mean, what is this Internet of Things? And actually, if you think about it, nobody talks about the Internet of Things now. It's all about artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence. So that was certainly a dissonance. He get enthusiastic for some reason about dog walking apps. Don't ask me why. I mean, he's got a thing about dogs. He likes dogs, teacup poodles.
Yeah. So in line with that, I remember when we were at Arena Hall, you were mentioning an earlier story as well of when he first was in Berkeley, he met a professor.
Yeah.
Can you tell that story again? And I feel like you kind of touched in that story a little bit about this dissonance too, of what the professor thought versus what he thought.
Yes. Dissonance is a very diplomatic way of putting it. You have to go back to 1977, 78. Masa is, he's barely around 20 years old. He's a young student. He hasn't developed a business at all, but He's told his father, his dad, that he's not going to go into business, he's going to study. He's also promised that he won't marry an American girl and that he'll come back to Japan. Well, he kept 2 of the 3 promises. He didn't marry an American girl and he did go back to Japan, but he did go into business. And he met a professor who I later tracked down, Professor Forrest Moser, who is now 95. He's still alive. I'm in touch with him regularly. And I met him when he was 92, and he told the story of how this young student turned up in his room and said, I hear you've got a microchip that will help work what's called a speech synthesizer. So you talk into the device and then it translates. And so the guy said yes, and he said, well, I want to work on it. I want you to develop a prototype. I think it would be amazing. You could use it in airports for visitors. And the Moses said he was too busy, but then he was persuaded that Masa had a good idea. So they go ahead and they get the thing to work. And Masa goes off, once he took Moser to Japan, he goes off and sells this prototype and the idea to Japanese consumer electronic companies, particularly, it was Sharp. Yeah. Now, according to the professor, he wasn't paid for any of his work. And I met another man who's in his late 80s, who was also in the computer lab. He claimed he didn't get any money either. But this young student was getting everybody to dance to his tune. And meanwhile, he promised Sharp that he could supply this prototype, including with the chips, which were supposedly going to be designed by National Semiconductor. Or not designed, but produced. But National Semiconductor didn't know that he'd gone and bypassed the National Semiconductor distribution network in Japan. And essentially, therefore, the professor claims he was totally misled and cheated on the deal. Masa denies that. It's important to say that it was just a misunderstanding. And, he did have to go back to Japan and unwind these deals. And there were several $100,000 at stake. So it wasn't a trivial amount of money, but I sort of look at it and think this was an example. It's sort of almost original sin. Nobody's perfect. Young entrepreneur. He's only a student. He's 20 years old. He wants to make money. And he probably took a shortcut. But certainly the professor, years later, is still pretty sore about it.
So, when I was reading your book, the thing I really loved the most was how nuanced the perspective was on not just portraying him as this messiah, and that's sort of how the other biographies on him have been a very one-sided sort of opinion. If someone was listening to this, what are some anti-lessons, things not to do that you picked up from Masa's leadership skills?
Well, beware of hiring mercenaries. I mean, he did have a number of quite talented executives, some of them from the Indian diaspora, one a very tough, talented enforcer operator, a guy called Marcelo Clary, Bolivian American. But these characters, including Rajiv Misra, who headed the Softbank Vision Fund, I mean, they fought like alley cats and they leaked to the media in their power struggles. Wonderful phrase, somebody said they leaked like septic tanks. And so this was bad for the business and the reputation. I think another point would be beware of founder syndrome, where you look at everybody just through your own perspective and background and temperament. So, he falls for Adam Newman, who's this totally charismatic founder of WeWork. And Masa, they lost about $14 billion on that deal. And there were plenty of serious people who said to Masa, stop this, it's not going to work. And Adam Newman is unreliable. And the company's numbers don't add up. And Masa just said, no. That's what everybody said about Alibaba. And I stuck with Alibaba and it was right. So he's a bit stubborn and blind. He's somewhat blinded by his own vision. So those are one or two of the kind of correctives. But he's very good at applying the art of war. He's very good at deception, giving the impression to people that he's a write-off, finished. And then meanwhile, he's plotting his comeback.
So speaking of comebacks here, this is an important point on the amount of times that he lost a lot of the money that he's investing into these companies during the dot-com bubble. You've mentioned 97% of his paper wealth out. What do we need to understand about Masa's story to connect the dots there? Like, what is he running away from there, and what is he moving towards at the same time to make these comebacks happen?
Well, the image that I would draw is that when he was growing up, he did spend time with his grandmother in the shantytown, and the homes were literally tin shacks. I mean, I've been around Mumbai, I've been around Kibera in Kenya, and I've been in Sao Paulo, the slums there. So I've seen what these places are like. They're pretty flimsy. And what would happen is that the Japanese railway employees would just take these shacks down at night. And the next morning, the Korean Japanese would rebuild them and stick them together again. And Masa is a bit like that. He could have his shack torn down, he could be humiliated, but he just comes back just like those Korean Japanese in the shantytown. He's amazingly resilient. He just refuses to give up. And I think that's partly if you're born with nothing, you're only going back to zero kind of thing. But I also think it's, no, there's another idea. There's another thing I can do. And he's adapted in each case to the technological trend. You know, from the microchip to the internet, he understood that the internet, okay, there's a dot-com bubble, but the internet's still going to be with us. And he goes mobile internet, and now he's doing artificial intelligence. So I think there's some real lessons for entrepreneurs in this respect.
Someone that is also very familiar with comebacks is Trump.
They're very similar characters. That's why they've bond. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, Trump's comeback I think he really feels there's been divine intervention. And he's the comeback kid of all time. I mean, from the courts, from the presidential election in 2020 to the assassin's bullet, he would say twice, not once. All this. Now, Masa, I don't think he's religious in any big way, but he's certainly, I think, probably quite spiritual. And he is the comeback kid. I mean, we're probably seeing his fifth big comeback now around artificial intelligence.
On this topic, Lionel, you know, they're both showmen in their own ways. How do you assess the authenticity and depth of the relationship beyond these public displays that you see between Trump and Masa?
It's totally transactional. Okay, they play golf together, and Masa is quite a good golf player, actually. I'd love to know whether he let Trump win when they did 6 hours of golf in Mar-a-Lago. But I think this is a meeting of interests. So Trump wants big money invested in America. Masa claims he's got hundreds of billions. I mean, the latest pledge is $500 billion in AI infrastructure, notably data centers built around computing power, and we can talk about that. But in 2016, he did the same thing and promised 50,000 jobs and 50 billion of investment. That's what Trump wants. But Masa also understands that America is the big market. And, you know, he's a global player, but the real opportunities are in America. But also he can use American technology and appropriate the brand. I mean, he did it with Yahoo, and he's now doing it with OpenAI, Sam Altman's company. He can take that back to Japan. So this is just mutual gratification and self-interest.
How has Masa navigated the relationships with China and the US?
Well, he did it very well, balancing the seesaw for a number, probably 20 years or so, because he first went to Japan in 95. He obviously had a big stake in Alibaba, probably one of the most powerful Chinese e-commerce internet companies, digital giant. But then after Xi Jinping, things become a lot more difficult because you have a distrust of the private sector, the tech champions. They think they're overweening and arrogant. Xi goes after Alibaba through its Ant Financial. They have to pull the IPO. Jack Ma lost maybe $37 billion as a result of his stake. Masa obviously suffered from that because they had the stake in Alibaba. And meanwhile, with the decoupling, Masa is a creature of globalization. So decoupling is not great for Masa. But it's not true to say he claimed he's now in with the West and with America. He had to choose. I think it's a little bit more nuanced. He still preserved some.
Yes.
Masa told me in the last interview that he had to choose between the West and China, that he couldn't straddle the two. I think that is largely true, and he's obviously pledging huge amounts of money for AI investment in America, but I don't think it's true to say he's completely cut all ties. He's got a stake in ByteDance, for example, owner of TikTok, and I don't think he sold all his shares in DoorDash either. So he's still got a foot or a few toes in China.
I posted this on my channel, and we got some curious, interesting folks wanted to ask you some questions around this topic, around Trump and Masa, but more so just around the US, where it's at right now. So, first question for you is the recent exchange at the Oval Office with Zelensky there. How do you see this episode play out? What's happening underneath there? What are your observations?
Well, President Trump, wants first a ceasefire and then a peace deal, and he's forcing Zelensky to agree to his terms. And he's going to get his way. What this has done is open up a huge divide with the European allies, who are very concerned that there could be what the import of a capitulation would be, that all the concessions have been made to President Putin up front. Why? So there are very serious implications for European security. And you can already see a response. So the German rearmament, just now the new incoming chancellors announced plans for massive increase in defense spending. And I think you're going to see whatever happens around Ukraine, a coalescing of the European allies and a greater attention to collective defense in Europe. Now, Trump wants this. He wants the Europeans to take more slack or take up the slack. But the way he's done it is in a very destructive way, and it's very, very much on Vladimir Putin's terms, which has truly shocked people in Europe.
Why is that?
Well, because they know that Vladimir Putin was the aggressor. He invaded Ukraine. They've abducted hundreds of children. They've committed massacres in Ukrainian cities. This was an unprovoked attack, an invasion, and people are very concerned about whether Putin would stop at Ukraine. Maybe he'll go for Moldova next, which is right next to Romania. Romania is part of NATO. Will he go to the Baltic states? Which certainly, and I've interviewed Putin twice, or interviewed him once, met him at length. He's never accepted the Baltic states really as independent countries, and certainly not in NATO. So this is, is NATO still a credible organization? Trump doesn't agree with the Europeans insisting on some kind of peacekeeping or assurance force, and says, first of all, you have to capitulate on my terms for the minerals deals to Zelensky. And if you Europeans insist on doing this, I will pull all American troops out of Europe. Can you imagine? This is very, very, very serious.
On interviewing Putin, how did you navigate that? I know that you tried building this rapport with him by speaking in German. You knew that he himself also spoke that KGB earlier, but how was that experience?
I prepared by asking experts, notably Bill Burns, this was the former ambassador to Moscow and who went on to be the director of the CIA. But I spoke to him before he took that job, and also Bob Zoellick, the former president of the World Bank, senior State Department official, both of whom knew Putin, spent time with him, watched him. And I think it was less speaking German was actually my way of saying, I know who you are, I know your background. And it was just to sort of surprise him slightly, because at the same time, I was very respectful towards him because he's a senior statesman and he liked that. So I didn't try to put him on the spot. I tried to build something of a respectful rapport with the Russian leader in the Kremlin. Interview was about an hour and 40 minutes. This was before Tucker Carlson.
Yes, it was. It was. One more question from the audience. What's your take on tariffs and how they're being implemented in the US?
Well, I think they're, to quote the Wall Street Journal, dumb. They're going to lead to more inflation. They're going to be extremely disruptive for American business. I think they'll probably cost some jobs too. I don't think they're going to move the needle massively on reinvesting in American manufacturing. You might move it, I don't know, 12% to 15%, maybe. Maybe they're a negotiating tool as much as an economic tool. I mean, you've seen the initial stock market response has been pretty negative. You know, Trump does tend to use these things as negotiating tactics as opposed to strategy. I worry about these people who think that he's deeply studied the record of President William McKinley in the end of the 19th century, and he thinks this is way of building, making America great again. I think it's the wrong move, and also, if you look at the last tariffs and competitive devaluations were what partly led to the Second World War in the 1930s. So protectionism is bad. I mean, you can have some temporary stopgaps to give relief to some industries under pressure from, say, state competition like China, but that's temporary relief. This is not temporary relief.
So I've had an observation. You can tell me if I'm off with this. There's been a rise in kind of putting such people like Trump and Masa even on a pedestal from the younger generation. There's more and more people that are kind of buying into these stories, right? And what do you think is happening underlying that? Why is that the sort of trend that is happening to put these people on a pedestal?
Well, I think they're different characters apart from the comeback, but I mean, one reason is that Trump is a brilliant communicator and he's turned everything into a soap opera. And he's used the Oval Office as a TV studio. And he's behaving as if people are like The Apprentice. So Zelensky got fired last Friday. I mean, this isn't a serious way of conducting high office. It's deeply concerning the way he's co-opting the media and intimidating the media. He's bringing in activists into the press pool rather than traditional experienced journalists. All this is imperial behavior. And for those younger generation that are not schooled in politics and don't understand really how democracy and liberal democracy is about compromises, they think that having a strongman and a dictator for the day solves problems. They don't understand that every action has a reaction, and that this is very unusual and dangerous behavior.
Can I ask you two more questions on this?
Yeah.
So, one on DOGE and the level of private individuals, quote unquote, being Musk and others that are now sort of part of this government's effort to try to streamline things according to them. How do you see that affecting the future of the US, but globally? How do you see that playing out?
I, DOGE is doing immense destruction. And there's a lot of people who are just institutional memory, expertise leaving. It's deeply disruptive. Why on the counterintelligence front? I mean, this is really, there's a price. And when there's a crisis, we're going to see the damage. I understand that some people might think the government's bloated, but this is just destructive. And some people in the tech space think it's brilliant. I'm not so sure about moving this fast and breaking this much.
Why do you think so? Why do you think it's destructive?
Well, you're firing thousands of people. You're seeing the whole top level of the FBI out. You're seeing people in the Justice Department who are responsible for people, that we do things right and follow the law. These people are going. You're seeing some of the best students who've joined the CIA, suddenly they're out the door because they happen to be last in, first out syndrome. And this isn't serious. If you're going to apply this kind of sweeping, of course you're going to save some money, but the collateral damage is serious.
Okay, and last question for you. Speaking of gambling, man, what's the biggest gamble that you've taken in your own career?
I got married to someone after only knowing them for 6 weeks and took them to the States in 1986. That was a gamble, but it paid off. I'm still married, 38 years on.
Thank you so much, Lionel.
All right. See ya.
See you.
Rush.
Thank you,
Thanks.
man.